I hope you're well wherever you are. Welcome to the first online lecture of Peace and Conflict Studies 1. As you should know, I'm Giorgio Shani and I'll be taking this course with you this term. So today I'll be introducing you to Peace and Conflict Studies, and we'll be relying very heavily on the work of Johann Galtung. So the lecture will focus on negative and positive peace and on Galtung's impact on the discipline of peace studies. Before I go through the lecture, I should point out that I have already uploaded 2 readings on Moodle by Galtung. His classic 1969 reading, in which he introduces the different forms of violence which we'll be looking at within the lecture, and introduces the idea of positive and negative peace, and also his 1990 lecture, which will answer the direct question, which I'll be asking, what is missing, later in the lecture. Okay, I should point out that this is really a very brief overview, and that the best way to prepare for the discussion next week would be to engage in the readings. Okay, so we will start by looking at understandings of peace, and understanding, although not necessarily a definition of peace. So we'll be posing the question, what is peace? Attempting to define it with reference to violence. This allows us then to interrogate or to critically examine the concept of violence. And following Galtung, we'll be looking at the various dimensions of violence, and this will permit us to differentiate between different ontologies of violence. Now, I am aware that Galtung does not use the term ontologies. I would like to use the word ontology here because I want to really underline the fact that Galtung is introducing us to different conceptions and different understandings of violence. This permits us to come up with a typology of peace. So we'll be looking at ideas of negative and positive peace, which are made possible by these different ontologies of violence, and approaches to peace. Approaches to peace refer to the institutionalization of these typologies of peace. So the idea is that ideas of peace are not just ideas which can be learned in classes, but are institutionalized and have an effect and an impact upon the world upon which we live. I will then pause and introduce the main question, which I would like you to discuss next week, and ask what is missing from this understanding of peace, from negative or positive peace, or from different understandings of violence, which I, following Galtung, will introduce you to. We will then attempt to, again using Galtung, answer this question, what is missing, and this will permit us to conclude by examining Galtung's peace formula, which he regards as a definition of peace. So basically what this lecture is attempting to do is to trace the development of Galtung's thought, so we can end up with an understanding of his formula, his definition of peace. Kindly note, as will be apparent throughout the course, this definition of peace is something which we will critically examine. So it is not to be accepted as a fact, but really as the beginning of a discussion. Okay, so what is peace? Well, again, following Galton's 1969 um, contribution to Journal of Peace Studies, Galton links ideas of peace to violence. So any definition of peace is in itself negative. It is negative in the sense that it is defined in terms of what it is not what in terms what it is. So Galton holds on to the conventional understanding of peace as connoting the absence of violence. However, he does not believe that this is a particularly full definition. It cannot be a full definition because we do not have a working understanding what violence is. Violence has many different dimensions or manifestations. So in order to be able to define, to be in a position to define peace, we need to be in a position to define violence. Now, this is arguably where Galton, Galton's true originality and his contribution to the field of peace studies and more widely to politics and international relations really lies in his understanding and conceptualization of violence. Now, in order to help us understand his definition, I've included a picture of a boy who might be around 13 to 14 years old, maybe even younger. Now, this picture was taken in the 1920s or 30s in a part of the world which was seen as advanced. This was the United Kingdom. However, the boy belonged to a coal mining community. So even within the United Kingdom, please remember that during the 1920s and 30s, Britain was a major imperial power. Indeed, there was an infamous saying that the sun never set on the British Empire because literally when the sun went down in one part of the world in the UK, it rose in another part of the world. This boy is male at a time in which there was institutionalized gender discrimination to a far greater extent than now. And this boy was from a dominant ethnic community. He would be seen as white. But here, because of an invisible structure here called class, we find that the opportunities which this boy has to achieve or to fulfill his potential is hindered or inhibited by the fact that he needs to work. So he's a member of a coal mining community, and instead of going to school, he goes down the pit, goes down a coal mine in order to support his family. So on the basis of this illustration, we can look at this lack of educational opportunities, which arises from the boy's acceptance of a seemingly natural social status in life, which means that he needs, instead of going to school, to work, as a form of violence in Galton's conception. So Galton argued that violence is the difference between the potential and actual, between what could have been and what is. So in this sense, anything which inhibits or hinders the achievement of what potentially you could achieve may be seen as a form of violence. Um, Now, Galtung is very specific in his reading. So he looks at ideas and he contrasts ideas of diseases such as tuberculosis, hunger, and also he mentions earthquakes or natural disasters. So if we look at tuberculosis, for example, right in the late 1960s, there was a cure for tuberculosis. So whereas, for example, in the beginning of Galtung's life in the 1930s, somebody dying of tuberculosis would not be seen as a form of violence, the fact that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, if somebody died of tuberculosis, then this was a form of violence because potentially tuberculosis could have been eradicated. Another example, a more contemporary example, would be polio. Many of you are Rotary Peace Fellows, and Rotary International has done a lot of work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to eradicate polio globally. So the idea is that even if somebody dies of polio today, when a cure is readily available, then it is seen as a form of violence. Galtung, again, writing, we have to understand his context in the late 1960s and early 70s, right at the beginnings of the Green Revolution, which in which genetically modified techniques revolutionized food production, believed that somebody dying of hunger and starvation, if somebody died of hunger and starvation, then this would constitute an act of violence because potentially we lived in a world of plenty. Again, if we go, 2 centuries back, when famines were seen as natural and resulted because of natural disasters, then this would not be seen as a form of violence. It's only because we now live in a world in which um, we can physically feed everybody, that the fact that there are people who go to bed hungry and who starve to death can be seen as a form of violence. We could go on and more controversially look at the example of education. Um, in many societies and possibly even here at ICU, which is one of the most, if not the most expensive educational institutions within Japan, uh, many people could potentially, or some people could potentially get into ICU, but not have the means to support themselves, not be able to pay the tuition fees. So this could also be seen as a form of violence. And indeed, in some societies, particularly in socialist societies in the 1960s and 70s, there was an assumption that education, including higher education, should be free. So basically, by looking at this definition, Galtung gives us a generic, by generic, I mean something which can be applied to different contexts, a generic definition of violence, which can be manifested in different dimensions and could be operationalized um, throughout this field of peace studies. So in conclusion, violence is seen by Galtung as the difference between the potential and the actual, between what could have been and what is. Let's look at the dimensions of violence which Galtung um, discusses in the reading. So perhaps dimensions may not be the appropriate word here, but we're looking at different components, perhaps, of violence, different questions which the study of violence poses. So one of the first dimensions which um, uh, Galtung discusses is whether violence is necessarily physical, whether there's a physicality to violence, or whether there's also a psychological dimension to violence. So the physical dimension of violence would be inflicting harm upon others. A psychological dimension of violence um, could be the very potential for violence, the very threat of violence, which can be seen as a form of violence itself. So Galtung poses this question, is violence physical or psychological? Interestingly, he also introduces the idea of negative or positive violence. So by negative violence, in English, we use the expression a carrot or a stick. A carrot is seen as an incentive. A stick is seen as coercion or punishment. So by looking at negative or positive violence, what Galtung is saying is that in a violent relationship, where there is a potential for coercion or for physical force, then the idea of a carrot, the idea of a reward, is itself an expression of a violent relationship. It's violent in itself. So a reward can be seen as a form of violence. A key question which arises from an examination of violence would be, is there an object that is harmed? Interestingly, Galtung uses the term object and he differentiates it from subject. So is there a subject which acts? Is there an object that is harmed? An object could be another human being. It could be the planet, it could be an environment. The idea is there must be harm inflicted on an object, on an entity. And this harm is also seen to um, to have been the work of a subject which acts, a subject which has agency. Again, please note, these are questions, these are not statements. So he's not saying there is a subject that is harmed, that there is a subject which acts. Is there an object that is harmed? Is there a subject which acts? Moving on, is violence intended or unintended? Now, this is directly linked with the idea of whether there is a subject which acts. If there is a subject which is capable of acting, we call this agency. So a subject which is capable of exercising agency, then this subject may potentially be capable of exercising violence. So in this sense, this is intended violence. If, however, subjects do not have agencies, yet there is still harm, then this violence can be seen as unintended. If this violence is unintended, it may not be felt as violence. Going back to the picture of the Welsh boy in a coal mining village, he may not think of himself as a victim of violence. He may think of himself instead as having opportunities to help support his family and to further himself. But by Galting's definition, there could be an argument for saying that in fact there is an invisible, a latent form of violence which socializes him into dropping out of school, not continuing with education, and going down a coal mine. Now, this itself is a form of violence in the same sense as physical coercion, which the boy may experience once he is down the coal mine. So, if we look at the dimensions of violence, physical or psychological, negative or positive, is there an object that is harmed? Is there a subject which acts? Is this violence intended or unintended? Is this violence manifest? Can we see it, or is it latent? Is it embedded, as we'll see, in certain structures which may not appear visible to the eye? On the basis of Galtung's generic definition of violence and the different dimensions which he unpacked through his exploration of violence, then I believe that we can differentiate between different ontologies of violence. Galtung doesn't use the term ontologies. An ontology is a philosophical term. It's basically a very complicated way of saying something is, so that there are different conceptions of violence, different ontologies of violence would be that the nature of violence itself is different. So Galtung differentiates between personal and direct violence and structural or indirect violence. The point I want to make is that these are different conceptions of violence. What constitutes violence differs according to the approach which we take, which is my rationale for asking you the question later, which approach the piece should we take? So if we look at personal violence is when there is a direct exercise or threat of physical or psychological violence by one social actor against another, usually by a state or an individual, or it could be by a class or by a governing elite against a particular group within society or a different group globally. So here the idea of a direct exercise or threat of physical or psychological violence means that there must be a subject which is capable of inflicting violence, a subject which has agency, which is capable of acting. So usually there is a perpetrator in this sense. The perpetrator could be a state against another state, or an elite against a group of people within a state. Usually there is a perpetrator and there are victims. So we see this in personal direct violence, the act of hitting somebody or the act of bullying somebody. There will be a perpetrator, somebody is responsible who acts, and a victim, somebody who is the recipient of the violent action. So examples of personal and direct violence include bullying, conflicts, or war. Please note the use of the term conflict here denotes a violent type of conflict. If we look at the field of peace and conflict studies, and also specifically at Galtung's work, he does differentiate between conflicts and violent conflicts. Violent conflicts are problems. Conflicts itself may or needs to be accepted as part of everyday life. And indeed, as we'll see later within the course, the denial of conflict itself can be seen as a form of violence. But the point here to be made is that an example of personal direct violence would be bullying, conflicts, war, crime. Now, war is a particular violent manifestation of conflicts between states. This is differentiated between, a differentiation can be made between war and civil war. Civil war is intrastate conflict, whereas war is seen as interstate conflict. The basic unit here is seen as the state, which again may be seen as a form of violence. This is something which we can examine later in the course. Let us differentiate personal direct violence with Galton's conceptual structural violence. Now, this is what he's hinting at with his generic definition of violence, making a distinction between the potential and the actual, between what is and what could be. So structural violence is that which prevents people from achieving their potential. Structural violence is when structures of unequal power do not allow the individual to realize her or his own potential. Um, so if we look at this form of structural violence, we can have victims, but no perpetrators. And indeed, the people who are seen as perpetrators may themselves be victims because they may themselves be caught up within these structures. So no identifiable perpetrators, but victims. So structural violence refers to these structures of unequal power, which privilege certain communities, which privilege certain classes, certain genders, certain ethnic groups over others. So examples can include racial or gender discrimination, which itself may not be intended, but if we look at structural racism, or if we look at structural gender discrimination as a result of patriarchy, the idea is that it is embedded within society itself. It is something which is not manifest, which is latent, which in which people's expectations are changed as a result of which racial or gender grouping which they may be part of. Social or economic inequality, we looked at the social inequality or economic inequality of class within the earlier picture. The idea that people born into certain castes and classes should follow certain occupations and not others. Poverty, unemployment, and importantly here, lack of access to education or access to healthcare can be forms of structural violence. So in societies, for example, where let's say women are not expected to go to school or not expected to go to university, this itself, or to get educated, this itself may be seen as a form of violence. The expectation may not have been created by a particular group of people, by perpetrators, but is embedded within the logic of society. So a good example here in Japan would be the idea of Abenomics. Abenomics, one of its crucial pillars, Abenomics was the economic policy, which is named after the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He was Prime Minister when you took this course. He's no longer Prime Minister now in Japan. But Prime Minister Abe sought to encourage the participation of women within the workforce within Japan. As we'll see later in the course, Japan is one of the most unequal societies when it comes to gender representation in the workplace. However, Japan actually regressed during Abe's prime ministership, and it is ranked amongst the most backward societies, to use another contested term, in terms of gender empowerment by the World Economic Forum. Now, the intent of Prime Minister Abe may have been to encourage participation of women within the workforce, but the structures here the structures of power which privilege people such as Prime Minister Abe in the first place, people from a particular socioeconomic background, people of a particular gender, meant that the reproduction of this unequal power created fewer opportunities for women. So women themselves felt that they were not in an enabling environment where their needs would be considered by employers. So structural violence really refers to these structures of unequal power. And unless there's an equalization of these structures of power, then violence will inevitably occur. There does not need to be perpetrators, but there are victims. There are certain groups globally who are privileged over others. Okay. Now, having differentiated or distinguished between these different ontologies of violence, so I think the point I want to make in terms of the ontologies of violence is going back the expectation that in the previous picture, a young boy would not continue their education because they need to find a job and they will go down a coal mine. This expectation can itself be a manifestation of unequal structures of power and can be seen as a form of violence itself, even if the boy does not come to a violent end in the coal mine or lives a relatively long life or earns money. It's still a form of violence because this expectation, which was a result of unequal structures of power, did not allow the boy to realize its potential. Similarly, when we look at the status of women within Japan, a woman, for example, who is working but who gives up her job in order to look after her family, may have young kids. This itself can be seen as a form of structural violence, because if we look at men, particularly within Japan, the assumption is that when kids are born, women will still look after those kids. And even though there is paternity leave within Japan, many men do not take that paternity leave because they do not believe it is their responsibility to look after the kids, or this may cost them economically. So here, this can be seen as the woman giving up her job voluntarily itself can be a manifestation, an internalization of structural violence. So turning to typologies of peace, we can differentiate between a negative peace, which refers to a state of non-violence, where there is an absence of threats of violence or violent conflict between states or individuals. Violence is understood as physical or direct violence and psychological. So a negative peace is really an understanding, or peace is understood as a state in which there is no threat of violence against another. There are no perpetrators. This is peace. So if we go back to our understanding of, or our discussion of Japan, Japan is, if we look at the idea of negative peace, a very peaceful society. It has one of the lowest crime rates in the OECD. There is an absence of threat of violence or violent conflicts, even though it does have the largest criminal organization in the world in terms of the Yakuza. So violence is understood in physical or direct violence is absent in most features of Japanese society, although the phenomenon of ijime, which is bullying, is prevalent within high schools. However, if we look at structural violence, as our previous discussion of gender discrimination within the workplace in Japan exemplifies, then we see that structural violence is at work within Japan. So countering structural violence means that we need to do something. There is a project. So this is a positive understanding of peace. Negative peace means you don't have to do anything. Negative peace means basically the definition of peace in terms of the absence of violence. The only thing you need to do is to protect citizens, to protect individuals, to protect groups from these threats of violence, which usually come from other states or people within that society itself. So if we look at positive peace involves not only freedom from conflict or freedom from violence, but also social justice. So social justice here means the creation of a society in which people have equal access, let's say, to education, employment, and healthcare, where there is no gender, ethnic, or racial discrimination. So positive peace leads to cessation for Galtung, not only of direct violence, but also of structural violence. So getting back to our definitions of two different ontologies of violence, from the perspective of negative violence, of negative peace, if we look at gender-related violence, then an example of gender-related violence would be violence by men against women, physical violence. Whereas from the perspective of positive peace means countering structural violence, which inhibit women getting the same employment opportunities or the same opportunities for promotion as men within the workforce. So positive peace leads to the cessation not only of direct violence, but also of structural violence. Now, how are these institutionalized within the world or within the world of international relations? Well, we can differentiate between two different approaches to peace. One is peacekeeping. Peacekeeping involves maintaining a negative peace. This can be done through protecting individuals or protecting the individual from direct violence, from physical violence. So examples include military and police forces, and internationally, the United Nations peacekeeping forces. So the idea of the military is to protect individuals or the people, the population, or communities within one nation state against violent acts committed by other nation states. The police force is internal. It is there to protect the citizens from perpetrators of violence by making sure that people obey the law. And internationally, we have the United Nations peacekeeping forces. There are many peacekeeping forces within the UN. Many of you listening to this lecture may have had experience working with the UNPKO throughout the world. The characteristic feature of UN peacekeeping forces, the blue helmets, because they wear blue helmets, they're referred to as blue helmets, is that they cannot use force unilaterally. They can only use force in order to defend themselves from once they are fired or if they are fired upon. So the idea of UNPKO is not necessarily to resolve conflicts. It's not conflict resolution, but it's peacekeeping to maintain stability. So one example which I'm familiar with would be the conflict in South Asia between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. So in 1948, um, the UNPKO, or UN peacekeeping forces were deployed along the line of control between India and Pakistan. So they physically inserted themselves between the combatants. This has now become the de facto border between India and Pakistan. And as we saw even last year, in 2019, the UN peacekeeping forces were fired upon by combatants, by jihadi organizations which were so sponsored allegedly by Pakistan and by the Indian state themselves, although the Indian state attempted to fire over the peacekeepers rather than on them. So this is an extreme example of maintaining a negative peace. So if we look at the situation in Kashmir, we can see that there is some sort of stability, some sort of negative peace has been maintained by the deployment of peacekeeping forces. Other examples can be seen throughout the world, Cyprus. We can look at the peacekeeping forces within Palestine and in other parts of the world, Timor-Leste. Okay, now this can be differentiated from peace building. Peace building sees peace as a project. So peace building refers to an attempt to create a positive peace. This means redressing the causes of structural violence by promoting social justice both within the state, by equalizing structures of power through the creation of equality, and internationally through development, equalizing the structures of power by encouraging international development. So peace building here seeks to go beyond merely keeping a negative peace or protecting individuals or groups or communities from threats of direct violence, but involves the creation of new institutional frameworks, the equalization of power structures in order to redress the causes of structural violence, promoting social justice. One form of social justice may be transitional justice, it may be debt reparations or forgiveness of or moratoriums on debt. Internationally, within the state, it means guaranteeing gender and racial equality. And internationally, it means changing global structures of power, which privilege some parts of the world over other parts of the world. Okay. Now, the question for discussion, which I'd like you to discuss next week, would be what should be the primary objective of peace studies, negative or positive peace? Which approach, in other words, to peace should we follow or should we seek to operationalize? Allied to this is a second question, which is what form or forms of violence is or are included in conventional accounts of peace studies. Now, I would like to answer this question in another segment, in another slide, which I will show later. So if you are listening to this lecture in your own time, then I think it is a good idea for you to focus first on this question, what should be the primary objective of peace studies? And then perhaps you can think what form of violence is or are included in conventional accounts of peace studies. So it is a good idea for you to pause here. Well, the form of violence which was absent in Galtung's earlier work was the conditions which made the exercise of both direct, personal, and structural violence possible. So in 1990, he revisits his understanding of violence and introduces the concept of cultural violence. So cultural violence is that which makes the exercise of direct personal violence or structural violence possible. Cultural violence for Galtung legitimizes both personal direct and structural violence. Now, there are different understandings of the word to legitimize. If we look at a straightforward definition of legitimize, which comes from Max Weber, legitimize here means basically legal. So it makes legal personal, direct, and structural violence. And we can, in fact, find many examples throughout history of both personal, direct, and structural violence, forms of personal, direct, and structural violence um, being legalized or being permitted legally. So an infamous example would be apartheid system within South Africa, in which racial discrimination, which arguably was practiced by many, if not most, societies throughout the world, was institutionalized by the apartheid system, which sought to keep distinct races, whatever the definitions of races were, separate. And not only separate, but to introduce a hierarchy, a racial hierarchy, which allowed the white minority within South Africa to exercise political and economic power and to restrict the mobility of the so-called black majority and also colored minority. If we look at forms of, we look at gender discrimination, then until Galtung started writing ideas of domestic violence were not only widely accepted, but seen as legal. So the idea of marital rape was seen as legal in many societies right up until the 1970s, if not before. So this is an example of how personal, direct, or structural violence can take a legal form. This speaks to one understanding of legitimacy and one understanding of to legitimize. However, another understanding of to legitimize means to make something appear right. So if we go back to our example of women in contemporary Japan giving up their jobs and the possibility of promotion in order to look after their families. This is a decision which a woman would make. It is not a decision which is made with reference to the law. There's no law which says that women have to give up their job if they're going to have kids. But it's this expectation, this acceptance of this acceptance that you will give up your job in order to prioritize your family, because this is a natural thing for you to do. This speaks to the idea of cultural violence. In other words, the violence which is embedded within culture. So cultural violence is that which makes personal, direct and structural indirect violence possible. Now, for Galtung, this can be done through what can be termed hegemonic discourses of religious traditions, and I would like to introduce the idea of secular ideologies, which naturalize these inequalities. Naturalize means to make something appear natural. So during the apartheid era, the idea was that different races were different. Because different races were different, it was natural for them to be kept apart. And inequality between these races was also natural. There were some races which were superior than other races in terms of certain faculties. So this inequality was seen as natural. Now, if we look at the southern states of the United States during the civil rights, right up to the civil rights movement, and arguably in the United States today, there may be people who do believe that inequality between different races and between different genders are indeed natural. But these inequalities are not codified within a particular legal system. They work through hegemonic discourses, which may be media, maybe the profiling of certain ethnic minorities or certain racial groups, or the profiling of women within mainstream media or within social media. This can be an example of a particular discourse. Now, the term hegemony, which I think is crucial here to Galtung's understanding of cultural violence, refers here to a relationship which is based on both consent and coercion. So again, if we come back to the example of a woman within Japan voluntarily giving up her job, consenting to give up her job. This is consent. But she's consenting to give up her job in order to look after her family, because this is a form of, in a way, invisible coercion. It is expected for her to look after the family. So even if she says, no, I want to get a promotion and find childcare instead, this would not be accepted within society, perhaps by her in-laws, or accepted within an immediate group in which this particular woman would be have access to or be seen as part of a community. Now, a lot of the discourse on cultural violence has focused very much on religious traditions. We see this particularly in some societies, such as the United States, where there is a very strong Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition and very strong Christian opposition to ideas of gender equality, such as ideas of, let's say, the freedom of choice of women to have a termination or not. Or also opposition to equal rights for the LGBT community. And specifically, I think we've seen an operationalization of this idea that there are some religious traditions which discriminate against certain groups, such as women or LGBT communities within the Islamic world. This can be seen as a hegemonic discourse, particularly coinciding with the war on terror in the 1990s. In the war on terror in the early 2000s, after the invasion of Iraq. One discourse was that Islamic societies, or traditional Islamic societies, not like Saudi Arabia, but like Afghanistan and Iraq, which Iraq, interestingly, was one of the most secular societies in the Middle East, most secular Islamic societies, uh, that you had a form of discrimination against women, which was deeply embedded within their understanding of Islam, within the dominant religious tradition, which is patriarchal. Now, within Japan, we find that there is no strong religious tradition. It is debatable whether there is a state religion within Japan. This is seen as Shintoism, but some people would argue that Shintoism is not itself a religion. However, there are very strong patterns of gender discrimination within Japan, which are secular, which do not have the legitimization from a religious tradition. Also, if we look at the secular ideology or the dominant secular ideology of liberalism today, ideas of equality of opportunity, well, this in a way can be seen to naturalize the structural violence of what some people call capitalism, following Marx. So capitalism is seen as a natural system. It's seen as the free market. It's seen as the only economic system which forms the basis of a global market today. So this is naturalized through the ideology of liberalism. Liberalism believes in equality of opportunity, believes we all should have the same opportunities um, to achieve um, goals, but it also accepts the idea that not everybody would be able to achieve their goals and objectives, that there is some sort of material inequality which is inevitable and which is natural. The important point is that we all start with the same opportunities. So this is Galton's definitions of cultural violence. So cultural violence is seen as those traditions, secular, religious, which legitimize both personal, direct, and structural violence. So it's a triangle here. So it's that which permits the operation of structural violence and that which permits the operation of physical or personal violence. I would also argue that one understanding of cultural violence, which was not explored directly by Galton, could be the nation state system itself, particularly when we look at personal violence, personal direct violence, then we see that there are certain groups of people, particularly those who are work for the state themselves, the security forces, the police force, who have the right, the legitimacy to use violence against others in order to protect the nation or the community of citizens, which is their responsibility. So we can see how the nation state system itself, the division of the world into different nation states, permits the reproduction of forms of personal, direct, and also structural violence. Okay, let us conclude by looking at Galton's peace formula. Now, I should point out that although I was present at the final lecture, keynote address in the Rethinking Peace Studies Conference at ICU in 2016, Galton at that conference, this was his only slide, did not explain what he meant by this peace formula. But this peace formula is an attempt to operationalize his understanding of peace. So for Galton, peace is equity and empathy. So if there is more equity and empathy in a particular society than there is trauma and conflict, then we can quantify how peaceful that society is. We can say that society is peaceful. So for sake of argument, if we could say that there is equity and empathy within a society such as Japan, more equity and empathy than trauma and conflict, then we can say that this society is peaceful. I don't know how he operationalizes it from a quantitative perspective. In other words, how you quantify how peaceful a society is. But I am aware that there are many organizations throughout the world, including the Institute for Economics and Peace, which has attempted to operationalize this formula and tries to ascertain how peaceful a particular nation state is. But what does he mean by equity, empathy, trauma, and conflict? Well, let's look at his dimensions. Well, equity refers here to equal access to healthcare, education, economic, political, and judicial systems. This is a guarantee of equity, and it is designed to counter forms of structural violence by equalizing structures of unequal power. However, equity is not enough. What is also needed is ideas of empathy, being able to understand the other, to feel joy and sorrow for others who may be differentiated from you ethnically, racially, in terms of gender. So it's that understanding of empathy which is necessary in order for there to be peace. If there is equity, but individuals or members of social groups only identify with members of their own social groups or only prioritize their own self-interest and do not engage with the other and are not able to feel the same joy and sorrow of others, then there cannot be peace. So he gives the example of starvation. Now, he believes, of course, that starvation in a world of plenty is a form of violence. So there cannot be starvation in a peaceful world. But what is necessary is not just the equalization of power structures so that everybody has access to healthcare, education, and economic, political, and judicial systems. What is necessary also is this feeling of empathy, being able to feel the pain of others, to feel the starvation of others. This is a necessary condition for there to be peace. Conflict refers to physical or direct violence, for example, wars, civil wars, crime, etc. And trauma results from psychological effects of violence. Okay, now the lecture in a way is finished. However, although I should not conclude, I would like to take this opportunity to conclude, to make some remarks, which I will explain in greater depth in the lectures throughout the course. So the first remark I'd like to say is both negative and positive peace are based on different ontologies of violence. So what I want to get away from is the idea of causality. Causality means structural violence causes direct or personal violence. This is not always necessarily the case. So the idea of highlighting the example of gender discrimination in the workplace in Japan, this is seen as a form of violence itself. The lack of education for this coal mining child, in fact, as you saw in the picture earlier, this is seen as a form of violence itself. It doesn't necessarily mean that women who are marginalized within the workplace or children who go down coal mines instead of going to school are likely to create violent conflict. It is a different ontology, a different understanding of violence. However, I would argue, and the editors of Rethinking Peace would argue, that ideas of negative and positive peace share the same foundational assumptions. A foundational assumptions means they are founded on the same ideas. There are assumptions which cannot be critically evaluated, assumptions which cannot be scientifically proved to be correct or not. And they share these assumptions. So both negative and positive peace assume peace to be a thing, to be a concrete reality, and to have a telos, an endpoint. We can achieve peace, associated with certain normative goals. Normative goals mean things which are right and wrong, which can be brought about through enterprise. Enterprise means doing things, undertakings designed to further the goals of peace. I will explain this not in the next week's class or after the discussion, but when we touch at the end of the course on the idea of rethinking peace. However, I would like to take this opportunity at least to share my views on Galton's work and the views of the other editors of Rethinking Peace in order to highlight a difference in approach, which arises from the definition of peace according to Galton's formula. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your discussion next week on the form of peace or the approach to peace which you find most convincing and why. Thank you very much for listening.